Every miracle Jesus ever performed gave something. Water became wine at a wedding that was about to run dry with shame. 5 loaves became enough to feed 5,000 hungry people with baskets left over. Blind eyes opened. Withered hands straightened. A dead girl's hand was taken, and she stood up. A dead man named Lazarus walked out of a tomb 4 days into decay. Every single recorded miracle in the 4 Gospels adds something to the world that was not there before: life, sight, food, healing, breath. Every miracle except one. On a Monday morning during the final week of his life, walking from Bethany toward Jerusalem, Jesus approached a fig tree in full leaf, found nothing on it but leaves, and spoke a single sentence over it: "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." By the next morning, the disciples found it withered from the roots up. Dead. Not injured. Not diminished. This is the only miracle in the entire New Testament where Jesus destroys something instead of creating, healing, or restoring it. And for 2,000 years, that fact alone has made readers deeply uncomfortable. Some have quietly wondered whether this is the one story where Jesus loses his temper. Hungry, irritable, taking out his frustration on an innocent tree that, as the text itself admits, wasn't even supposed to have fruit yet. Skeptics have used this exact story for centuries as a favorite example of an apparently unjust or arbitrary act attributed to Jesus. Proof, they argue, that even the Gospel's own writers occasionally recorded him behaving less like the compassionate healer of the rest of the narrative. That reading treats the strangest detail in the whole story as an embarrassment to explain away. It is actually the opposite. The detail, that it was not the season for figs, is not a flaw in the narrative. It is the confession sitting at the center of it. The single clue that unlocks why this tree, and only this tree, met an end no other living thing in the Gospels ever met. And Mark, who tells this story more carefully than any other Gospel writer, does something with it that most readers rush past entirely. He splits the story in half, and inserts an entirely different scene into the middle of it: Jesus overturning tables in the temple courts. Before returning, the next morning, to show the disciples what happened to the tree. 2 scenes. 1 story. A cursed fig tree wrapped around a cleansed temple, each one explaining the other. Tonight we're going to walk through both halves slowly, the botany hiding in a single Greek phrase, the literary structure Mark built on purpose, and the verdict Jesus was actually pronouncing. Start with the strangeness on its own terms, before reaching for any explanation at all. Jesus is hungry. This detail matters more than it first appears. Mark records it plainly, without embarrassment. The same way the Gospels record Jesus growing tired, weeping, and sleeping through a storm. He is fully human here, walking the road from Bethany with an ordinary appetite. When he sees a fig tree ahead, conspicuously covered in leaves, he goes to it, looking for something to eat. This alone tells you something about how fig trees were understood in first-century Judea. Leaves on a fig tree were not merely decoration. They were a signal, read instinctively by anyone who had grown up around orchards. The same way a modern person reads a lit window as a sign someone is home. Jesus approaches the tree because the leaves themselves made a specific promise. He finds nothing. Not less than expected, nothing at all. And in response, he speaks a curse over the tree that will still be verified, publicly, the next morning, in front of the same disciples who heard him say it. This has troubled careful readers for centuries, and honest theologians have never pretended otherwise. If Jesus is the same figure who fed thousands from a boy's lunch, who restored a soldier's severed ear in the garden of his own arrest, who never once uses his power for anything but mercy, why does his very last recorded miracle break that pattern entirely? The answer that actually satisfies the question is not found in Jesus's mood. It's found in the sentence structure of a single verse, 1 clause long. that most readers read straight past on their way to the more dramatic action, for it was not the season for figs. Mark did not need to include that clause. If this were simply a story about a hungry man losing patience with a barren tree, the detail actively undermines the story. It makes Jesus look unreasonable, cursing a tree for failing to produce something it was never scheduled to produce in the first place. A writer trying to protect Jesus's reputation would have cut this line. Mark kept it. Which means the line is not an accident, and not an embarrassment. It is the key Mark handed his readers on purpose. And it depends entirely on something almost no modern reader knows about fig trees. A fig tree branch, on close inspection, hides a secret almost every modern reader has never noticed. Fig trees do something unusual among fruit-bearing plants: they produce fruit before they produce leaves. In the agricultural calendar of first-century Judea, a fig tree's true harvest, the mature, ripe figs eaten at the height of summer, doesn't arrive until months after spring begins. But before that main crop ever forms, and before the tree's full leaves have even finished unfurling, the earliest branches put out small, early, edible buds. Travelers on the roads around Jerusalem knew this well. These small green nubs, sometimes called the taksh, weren't the final harvest, but they were genuinely edible. Their presence was the tree's own honest signal that real fruit was forming underneath. This is the detail that changes everything about the scene. A fig tree that has already put out full leaves has necessarily already passed the point where those early edible buds should be visible too. Because in a fig tree's actual growth pattern, the leaves do not arrive first and empty-handed. They arrive alongside, or even after, this first small offering of fruit. A fully leafed fig tree with nothing on it at all was not a tree that was simply early for its formal harvest season. It was a tree advertising a maturity, a readiness, a fruitfulness it had never actually developed. This is precisely what Mark's little clause is protecting. He is not making an excuse for Jesus. He is closing a loophole for the tree. If Mark had left the detail out, a reader might reasonably think the tree was simply unlucky, out of season, condemned for a timing it couldn't control. By stating plainly that it was not the season for the main crop, and immediately following that with the fact that the tree still had nothing at all, Mark removes every excuse the tree might otherwise have had. This was not a tree caught before its time. This was a tree that had raised a flag of readiness it could not back up. Every other fig tree on that road, Mark implies without needing to say it, was bare, leafless, honestly announcing that its season hadn't arrived yet. This one tree stood out precisely because it looked further along than it was. It had leafed out early, made itself conspicuous, drawn the eye of a hungry traveler from a distance. Old Testament writers had already used this exact image, centuries before Mark, to describe a nation that had learned to perform devotion without producing it. Jeremiah pictures God searching a vineyard for grapes and finding none, then searching the fig tree beside it and finding no figs on the fig tree, even the leaves are withered. Hosea compares Israel's ancestors to the first fruit on the fig tree in its first season, a people once genuinely, immediately fruitful, contrasted against the barren generation Hosea was actually addressing. By the time Jesus stands in front of this particular tree, the fig tree had already been Israel's own prophet's preferred image for a nation whose worship had stopped matching its appearance. Jesus did not curse a barren tree for being barren. Barren, out-of-season trees lined that entire road, untouched, exactly as they should have been. Jesus cursed the one tree that dressed itself in the appearance of fruitfulness it did not possess, the one tree performing readiness instead of actually carrying it. This is not a story about a temperamental miracle worker punishing nature for its own natural limits. It is a story about a very specific kind of failure, not the failure of not yet being ready, but the failure of advertising a readiness that was never real. Mark's Gospel is not told in the order you might expect, and this particular passage is the clearest example in the whole book of a technique scholars now call Markan intercalation, informally, sandwich. Mark begins a story, deliberately breaks off in the middle of it to tell an entirely different story, and only then returns to finish the first one. When Mark does this, it is never an accident of clumsy editing. It is his signature way of telling his readers, these two stories interpret each other. Here is exactly how the sandwich is built. Verse 12 through 14, Jesus curses the fig tree in the morning, on the road into Jerusalem. Verses 15 through 19, Jesus enters the temple, drives out the money changers and merchants, overturns their tables, and quotes the prophets at the astonished crowd. Verses 20 through 25, the next morning, walking the same road again, the disciples find the fig tree withered to its roots. Fig tree. Temple. Fig tree again. The temple scene is not a detour from the fig tree story. It is sitting inside it on purpose. Held on both sides by the same withering verdict, so that a reader cannot walk away from either half without carrying the other half along with it. Once you see the sandwich, the parallel becomes almost impossible to miss. The fig tree looked impressive from a distance, full leaves, conspicuous, promising fruit. The temple, in that same week, looked impressive from a distance too, rebuilt on a massive scale by Herod the Great decades earlier, its courts crowded with worshippers. Its outer walls visible for miles, the single most recognizable religious structure in the entire region. Both the tree and the temple were, by every outward measure, thriving. And both, on close inspection, had nothing underneath. The fig tree had no fruit where its leaves had promised fruit would be. The temple, Jesus discovers when he walks through its outer court, had no room left for the very thing it was built to do. Because the space set aside in the court of the Gentiles, the one section where non-Jewish worshippers were permitted to pray, had been filled instead with tables of currency traders and cages of sacrificial animal merchants. The house that was supposed to gather the nations in prayer had been crowded out by the machinery of its own commerce. Jesus does not simply clear the tables in anger. He quotes scripture as he does it, and the specific quotation matters enormously. Is it not written, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations"? But you have made it a den of robbers. The first half of that sentence comes from Isaiah, describing God's house as a place explicitly welcoming to every nation, not only Israel. The second half comes from Jeremiah, spoken centuries earlier as a direct accusation against a generation of Israelites who treated the temple as a safe hideout for injustice. As if showing up to the right building on the right day could cover for a life that bore no real fruit the rest of the week. Jesus is not accusing the temple's leadership of ordinary greed alone. He is accusing them of exactly the fig tree's specific failure, dressing an empty structure in the appearance of fruitfulness, and trusting that the appearance would be enough. To understand exactly what den of robbers was accusing the temple leadership of, it helps to understand what those tables in the outer court were actually for. Traveling worshippers arriving in Jerusalem for the festival needed two things the temple system itself controlled: acceptable currency, since Roman coins bearing the emperor's image were considered unfit for the temple treasury. And acceptable sacrificial animals, since any animal a worshipper brought from home had to first be inspected and approved by temple officials before it could be offered. Both systems existed, in theory, to serve genuine worship. Both had, by the week Jesus arrived, become opportunities for exploitation. Money changed at inflated rates, animals inspected and conveniently rejected until a worshipper had no choice but to buy a temple-approved replacement at a temple-controlled price. None of this occurred in a back room, hidden from view. It occurred in the court of the Gentiles, the outermost, most public court of the entire temple complex. The one area where a Roman centurion, a Greek merchant, or an Ethiopian pilgrim could come near enough to pray to the God of Israel without needing to convert first. This was, by design, the temple's most outward-facing invitation to the nations Isaiah had described centuries earlier. And this was precisely the space that had been filled, wall to wall, with tables and livestock pens, until there was no longer any room left in which a Gentile could actually pray. Picture what this meant practically for the very worshippers this court was built to welcome. A traveler arriving from Rome or Alexandria or Ethiopia, having journeyed for weeks specifically to pray, would have found that space transformed into something closer to a crowded livestock market, the bleating of animals awaiting inspection, the clatter of coins being weighed and exchanged. Merchants calling out prices, with no quiet corner left in which to actually kneel and pray. The house of prayer for all nations had, quite literally, no room left for the nations to pray in. The leaves were the temple's continued operation, sacrifices still offered daily, festivals still observed on schedule, priests still moving through their ancient rotations exactly as the law prescribed. Every outward function of the temple was still, technically, running. But the fruit the temple existed to produce, a house of prayer genuinely open to every nation, a place where the presence of God was made accessible rather than monetized, had been crowded out by the very commerce meant to support it. This is why Jesus' accusation reaches back to Jeremiah specifically. Centuries earlier, Jeremiah had stood at that same temple's gate and warned a generation of Israelites who believed the temple's mere existence guaranteed their safety, regardless of how they lived the rest of their lives. Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, and then come and stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and say, we are delivered? Jeremiah's original charge was never really about commerce at all. It was about a religious system functioning as camouflage, a place where injustice could be committed everywhere else in the city, as long as the correct rituals were still performed on schedule inside the walls. Jesus is not introducing a new complaint. He is pointing at a very old one, and showing the crowd that the same pattern was still, remarkably, alive in the very generation standing in front of him. Leaves in full display. Fruit nowhere to be found. The next morning, walking the same road back into Jerusalem, Peter notices the fig tree first and says what everyone can plainly see, "Rabbi, look. The fig tree you cursed has withered." Mark is careful here, and the detail is easy to miss on a quick reading. The tree is withered from the roots up. Not the leaves first, drying slowly from the outside in, the way a plant naturally fades when it stops receiving water. The roots themselves are gone. Whatever was sustaining the tree from underneath, the actual source feeding the appearance visible above ground, had been cut off entirely, all at once, overnight. This is not incidental to the lesson Jesus draws from it. He does not use the withered tree to launch into a speech about botany, or even primarily about the temple leadership's specific failures. He turns immediately to a teaching about faith. Have faith in God. Whoever says to this mountain, be lifted up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart but believes, it will be done for him. Given where they were standing, in plain view of the Temple Mount itself, this was almost certainly not a generic teaching about mountains in general. Jesus was very likely pointing, quite literally, at the mountain the temple sat on, telling his disciples that the very structure whose leaves had just been exposed as covering an empty root system would not stand forever either. This reading is confirmed by what Jesus says just 2 chapters later, sitting across the valley from the temple with his disciples, looking back at the same buildings. Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. The withered fig tree was not an isolated object lesson about personal faith, detached from everything Mark had just shown his readers. It was a preview, acted out on a roadside tree, of a judgment about to fall on a much larger structure just up the road. One whose roots, Jesus was saying, had already failed long before its outward leaves gave out. And notice what Jesus does not say. He does not curse the temple itself, or call down fire on its courts. He clears tables, quotes prophets, and walks away. The same restrained, almost patient response he gives the fig tree, a single sentence spoken once, with the verdict allowed to work itself out naturally, visibly, on its own timeline, in front of witnesses who could see the whole process from beginning to end. Every other miracle in the Gospels adds something the world didn't have before. This is the only one that takes something away. And once you see what Mark actually built, it stops looking like an exception to how Jesus normally works, and starts looking like the most precise judgment he ever pronounced. Not against a tree that was simply out of season. Not against a temple that had stopped functioning. Against something both had in common. The appearance of fruitfulness, fully displayed, with nothing real underneath to back it up. The bare trees along that same road were never touched. They had nothing to offer, and made no claim otherwise. It was the leaf tree, the one advertising a readiness it never possessed, that met the only destructive miracle Jesus ever performed. Mark placed the temple scene inside the fig tree story on purpose, and closed the sandwich the next morning with a single detail easy to miss, withered from the roots up, not fading slowly from lack of water, but the root itself gone, all at once. The hidden source finally matching what had been true of the visible branches the whole time. Leaves are not the danger. The danger is leaves without roots deep enough to feed what they promise.